Jim Bob Duggar called an emergency meeting and summoned every single one of his adult children home the moment news broke about Joseph Duggar's arrest. And what happened next reveals everything you need to know about how this family operates under pressure. Sources say that siblings who were traveling or working out of state were ordered to drop everything and come back. And one of those siblings was Joseph Duggar, who was reportedly out of state working on a FEMA tree cutting project when he got the text from Jim Bob. And according to sources, Jason's reaction was unlike anything people around him had seen before, because Jason, who reportedly never curses, was absolutely furious, saying he could not believe Joseph would be so stupid, could not believe he would do this, asking why he did not learn anything from Josh, and expressing genuine horror at what his brother had done. And while Jason remains the only Duggar son to have made any kind of public statement about this situation, the question of where his loyalties truly lie is one that is still being carefully watched, because the history of this family makes it very hard to take any Duggar son at face value when they claim to be standing on the right side of something. Once everyone was gathered, Jim Bob laid out the strategy. He told his adult children who they could and could not speak to, what they could and could not say, and who they were and were not allowed to discuss any of this with. And the fact that a 60-year-old man is still dictating the communication rules for his adult children in their 20s and 30s tells you everything about the level of control Jim Bob Duggar maintains over every person in his orbit. And for the most part, those children are complying. The statements being released are coordinated and organized. And the machine of Duggar image management is running even while Joseph sits in a Florida jail and Kendra faces 8 criminal counts in Arkansas. Now there is something important to address about Joseph's demeanor during his booking process, because multiple sources have noted that he seemed remarkably calm, almost unbothered, as though this was just another ordinary day and not the beginning of a process that could put him in prison for the rest of his life. And understanding why he seems so unbothered requires understanding the world he was raised in and the specific environment that shaped him and his brothers from childhood. Because what sources have shared this week paints a picture of a community where the sexualized abuse of children was so normalized, so openly discussed, and so consistently mishandled that the boys who grew up in it literally do not have the psychological framework to understand that what they have done is a crime with serious consequences. Here is what sources who were part of the various home churches that the Duggars ran over the years have shared. And I want to be clear that these are people who were children themselves when they witnessed these things. During church services at these Duggar-connected home churches, it was not uncommon for adults to stand up and publicly confess what the community called moral failures against children. And the fact that they called it a moral failure and not a crime is itself the most revealing thing about how this community processes child sexual abuse. Because if you do not call it a crime, you do not treat it like a crime, and you do not respond to it like a crime. One specific incident that 2 separate sources described involved a man standing up in a church service and confessing that he had been sexually abusing his 5-year-old daughter. And rather than that confession resulting in a phone call to law enforcement, what followed was a community discussion about how to handle it internally, and Jim Bob Duggar, who as a church elder would have been a mandated reporter under Arkansas law, allegedly did not go to the police, did not call DCFS, did not do anything that the law required him to do, but instead put this man on church discipline and allowed him to continue attending services, meaning that children, including the Duggar children, were sitting in those services alongside a man who had just publicly confessed to sexually abusing a toddler. And they were being taught that this is what happens when something like that comes out. You confess, you do church discipline, you stay in the community, and life goes on. A second family that sources described involved a father and his son both confessing, the father to abusing his daughters, the son to abusing his sisters. And again, Jim Bob allegedly did not go to police. The husband was eventually arrested, but not because of anything Jim Bob did. It was because someone called police when something was actively happening, and the son ended up in juvenile detention not because of any Duggar intervention, but because the system intervened independently, and the family eventually left the church community, but not before the damage had been done to everyone around them. A third case involved a stepfather confessing to abusing his stepdaughters, and again, Jim Bob counseled against going to the police. And this pattern case after case after case of confessions of child sexual abuse being handled internally with Jim Bob at the center, directing the response, tells you that what happened with Josh Duggar was not an anomaly and was not a failure of judgment in a single moment. It was the predictable output of a system that Jim Bob had been running for years. A system where he positioned himself as the de facto counselor and cure for men who had committed these acts, where he promoted the IBLP and its programs as the solution, where he allegedly paid for certain individuals to attend the Alert Academy or go through Bill Gothard's seminars. Seminars that taught, among other things, that the reason men abuse children is because of the victim's behavior, what they wore, who their friends were, how they acted, framing the child as partially responsible for what was done to them, which is not just wrong, it is one of the most harmful and dangerous ideas that can be put into the head of someone who has already committed these acts, because it removes all accountability and replaces it with justification. Jim Bob was not just failing to report, he was actively building an alternative system, an IBLP pipeline in Northwest Arkansas, where families in crisis would come to him, where he would tell them not to go to the authorities, where he would offer the IBLP as treatment, even though the IBLP is not a treatment program. It is not certified. It is not therapy. It has no clinical basis whatsoever. It is cult self-help wrapped in biblical language. And Jim Bob was functioning as its local ambassador and gatekeeper. Which raises a question that has not been answered publicly. Was he receiving any financial benefit from promoting the IBLP and funneling these families into their programs? Because the level of commitment and enthusiasm with which he allegedly pushed these programs on family after family after family is difficult to explain purely as genuine belief. And then there is the element of this that is perhaps the most chilling. Jim Bob was not just counseling these men and sending them away, he was in some cases bringing them into his home. Housing offenders who had confessed to abusing children in the same house where his own children were sleeping. In the same bedrooms, because all the boys shared one room and Jim Bob would move these men into that space. Meaning, the Duggar children from a very young age were being routinely exposed to men who had admitted to committing these acts and were being taught simultaneously that these men were being handled appropriately, that the IBLP had the answers, that the police were not to be trusted, that DCFS was the enemy, that going to authorities was akin to inviting Satan into your life, and that the right and godly response to child sexual abuse was silence, prayer, and a Bill Gothard seminar. This is why Joseph seemed calm at his booking. This is why Josh showed no genuine remorse. This is why these boys do not seem to grasp the gravity of what they have done, because they grew up in an environment where this was normalized to such a profound degree that their brains literally do not have the category for what they did being a crime, with life-destroying consequences. Because in the world they were raised in, it was a moral failure that you confess, get counseled on, and move past. And the only reason any of this is now in the legal system is because the Caldwell family, unlike every family that Jim Bob got to first, did not let him handle it in-house, and Paul Caldwell went directly to law enforcement. And that single act of courage by one father broke the entire system that Jim Bob has been running for decades. Now I have to address the girls in this story, because their experience is its own form of devastating. From birth, the Duggar daughters and daughters of families in this community are told that their only purpose is to be a wife and a mother, that they must live under the authority of their husbands, with no rights, no ability to work or pursue education, no ability to speak negatively about their husbands regardless of what those husbands do, and if something is done to them, they are told that they are mighty warriors for Christ, that their suffering is a badge of honor, that God is using their pain to make them strong, which is one of the most insidious forms of spiritual abuse imaginable, because it takes genuine trauma and reframes it as a gift, ensuring that the victim not only does not report, but actually feels grateful for what was done to them. And the boys watch all of this growing up, and they learn that there are no consequences, that girls will not report, that the community will protect them, that Jim Bob will handle it, and that all they have to do if they get caught is confess and go through some IBLP training and everything will be fine. And that is exactly the environment that produced Josh Duggar. And that is exactly the environment that produced Joseph Duggar. And according to sources, that is the environment that has produced other situations involving other Duggar sons and their friends that have not yet become public, but may very well soon, because there is now an active investigation being conducted in Tontitown into the entire Duggar family, including Jim Bob Duggar himself, and including the broader network of home church families connected to them. And investigators want to get to the bottom of this, but they need people to come forward, because the information that can be shared publicly is limited, and what investigators need are actual victims and witnesses who can be interviewed directly and whose accounts can be formally documented. And I want to speak directly to anyone who grew up in these home churches, anyone who was in and out of the Duggar house, anyone who knows what happened in those spaces and has been carrying that knowledge for years. You need to know that in the state of Arkansas, for many forms of child sexual abuse, there is no statute of limitations, meaning it is not too late to report, and even if charges cannot be brought, a police report creates a formal record that investigators can use to build a pattern, to connect dots, to show that the same people have been reported multiple times, and that record matters, and it protects future children. The non-emergency contact line for Tontitown Police is 479-361-916-8. And if what happened to you or what you witnessed is connected to the Duggars or their home churches, you can call that number, ask to speak to a detective, and report what you know, and they will direct you to the right place from there. I reported my own assault in 2007, and my perpetrator was never charged, but I know that I did my part. I know that the record exists, and I know that if he ever hurt someone else, there is a file with my name on it that says he has done this before, and that matters, and your report matters, and your voice matters. And the only way this cycle ends is if enough people are brave enough to break the silence that Jim Bob Duggar has spent his entire life building and maintaining. This investigation is active, it is real, and the people running it want to help. And the bravest thing anyone who has been touched by this world can do right now is pick up the phone.